Last Sam's Cage by David A. Poulsen, Chapter 18, page 197. The bus stop had a shelter, and he squeezed inside with several other people. The rain was pouring down harder again, but the wind coming from behind the shelter, not much of it was getting in. "Some rain, huh?" somebody said. Eddie didn't look around to see if the speaker was talking to him. He didn't feel like talking. "I heard it's supposed to do this most of the night," a second person said. "You'd think we were in Vancouver," the first voice replied. Eddie was glad when the lights of the bus appeared down the street. He moved out of the shelter to wait at the curb, even though it meant standing in the rain. He wanted more than anything to be by himself. He wanted to think and how hard it would rain, and for how long was the last thing he wanted to think about. He got on the bus and was glad when nobody sat beside him. He stared straight ahead, not seeing anything but the pictures in his head. They weren't nice pictures. He could see Steve's face twisted with uncomfortable fury, his fist coming down again and again, and sometimes even that wasn't enough to satisfy Steve's need to hurt. Then it was weapons, whatever he could lay his hands on, a hockey stick, a beer bottle, the massive belt buckle, and finally the cord from the iron, each one with its own set of marks left behind. But there was always the pain. Eddie could count on that every time. Now Steve was gone. What did that change? Anything? Eddie believed his mother when she said Steve had threatened to kill them both. But surely, when she'd been down the hall and heard his screams, that's when she should have done something, and she hadn't. That was the worst picture of all. The picture of his mother sitting, maybe with her hands over her ears to keep out the sound of his pain, letting it happen. Eddie almost missed his stop. He wasn't paying attention, and the bus was about to pull away when he realized that this was where he had to transfer to the bus that would go by the zoo. Eddie jumped up and rang the bell. He pulled the cord 3 or 4 times. The driver stopped and looked back. "Take it easy, I can hear the bell, whether you pull it once or 50 times. Another time, Eddie might have smart-mouthed the driver, but this time he just shrugged and mumbled sorry as he quickly stepped off. If anything, the rain was coming down even harder now. Eddie was glad to see another bus shelter, and he hurried inside. He thought ahead to the run from the bus stop to the condo. He wasn't looking forward to it, but he could hardly wait to be in under the rock outcrop, dry and far away from the whole world. The bus came, and Eddie was its only passenger. He was glad. No more stupid conversation. This time Eddie was ready for his stop. From the moment he'd step onto the bus, he hadn't stopped looking out into the wild, blustering night. When the doors hissed open, he hit the pavement running. He calculated as he ran, 2 long blocks or maybe 3 short ones, then down the fence to the hole. A short sprint past Denny to the stream. Over the fence and to the condo. He'd pull his clothes off outside. It would be too hard to get the wet stuff off in the tiny space. Lightning cracked off to his right, and a few seconds later an explosion of thunder made him flinch. He was at the fence. Climbing through the hole, he snagged his shirt. Now it was both sopping wet and ruined. Damn, trying to hurry too much. He forced himself to slow down. More lightning and another clap of thunder, not as loud this time. As he worked himself free, he realized he was out of breath from the run. There was no point in sprinting anymore. He couldn't possibly get any wetter. He trotted easily away from the fence and toward Denny. Even without thunder noise, the noise of the storm was so loud he could barely hear the slap of his runners on this wet pavement. Water was running down his face and into his eyes, and it wasn't easy to see. Maybe that's why he didn't see them, not until he practically ran into them. He would have been surprised to see two people out anywhere on a night like this, but especially here, it looked as if they had been standing under Dinny's huge belly. He hoped it was just a couple of visitors who hadn't gotten out before closing time. Better that than security guards. It wasn't visitors or security guards. For the second time that night, Eddie was surprised by a voice he hadn't expected to hear. "It's been a long time, Eddie. Nice to catch up with you again." Another flash of lightning. This one right overhead seemed to light up the whole world. Stink Pegler was grinning. In that first stab of panic, Eddie didn't recognize the other man right away. He was grinning too, and Eddie had seen that grin before. As the lightning lingered a second time, Eddie remembered where he'd seen it. Jules didn't say anything. He just grinned and let Stink do the talking. Kind of a good night to die, don't you think, Eddie?" Stink Pegler took a step forward. Eddie stepped back as he did. He heard a click and looked down to see a switchblade in Stink Pegler's hand. Eddie knew that Stink wasn't kidding and wasn't just trying to scare him. Stink would cut him up bad and enjoy the experience, and he had a feeling that Jules wasn't just along to watch. Stink would probably get a charge out of letting Jules have some fun with Eddie before it was all over. It was a bad dream. This stuff only happened on TV and in movies. The thought kept flashing like a neon sign in Eddie's head. Bad dream. Bad dream. Eddie hoped he'd wake up soon, but it wasn't a bad dream. It was real. And as lightning flashed again, this time further to the west, the pair took another step closer toward Eddie. Eddie wanted to run, but he couldn't. It was like the fear had taken over his mind and willed his body to stay frozen in place. Yelling was useless. The storm had no doubt driven the security guards indoors, and even if they were out on the grounds, they'd have to be standing almost next to Eddie to hear him over the roar of the storm. How did you know I was here?" It didn't really matter, and he didn't think they'd bother to answer him, but he needed time to think. If he could keep them talking even for a minute or two, maybe he could come up with an idea. "Well, you see, Eddie," Stink studied the blade of the knife as he spoke, "I asked around, and some people told me you like to break into houses. Now that surprised me. I never would have thought a little puke like you would have the guts. I guess I was wrong. Guess you must be a tough guy after all. And tonight we're going to find out how tough you are." Stink spat on the pavement. "Anyway, I figured you might need to fence some stuff sometime, so I stopped by and talked to my friend Jules. I said if a stinky dumb shit kid came into the store that he should maybe find out where the skinny dumb shit kid went and let me know. So when you left Jules' little business palace, he just followed you back here." Eddie looked at Jules. The man was so puffed up with Pegler's praise that he looked as if he could explode at any minute. Weird that a guy Jules' age would think that a teenager was some kind of hero. But then again, Jules was weird. "I told you I should have been a little friendlier." Jules put his hand on the front of his pants like he had that day in the store. "But maybe we can do something about that unfriendly attitude of yours." "We got a place picked out for our little meeting," Stink said. "So let's get out of the rain and let the games begin." Stink laughed at that. The laugh was high-pitched, not what Eddie expected at all. Eddie backed up again, but he was running out of room. There was a temporary fence behind him. He remembered the workmen putting it up a few days before. What the hell had they put up a fence here for anyway? He was out of room and would soon be out of options. He couldn't go forward or backward. Stink was on his left, and the switchblade he was brandishing made that option very unappealing. That left only the right. A clap of thunder roared overhead, the loudest one so far. All three jumped at the ear-splitting crash. Eddie used the temporary distraction to make his move. He bolted to his right and passed Jules before the older man could react. Eddie wasn't much of an athlete, but he had always been fast, and desperate fear was a powerful motivator. He had never been more scared in his life, not even with Steve. He was closer than he'd ever been to his own death, and he knew that these two creeps would make it as horrible as they could. He ran hard, but the sprint from the bus had tired him out, and he wasn't sure how long he could keep it up. He managed to peek over his shoulder when it came to running. Stink was no slouch. He wasn't far back, and Eddie hadn't been able to put any more distance between them. He couldn't see Jules, but it didn't matter. He knew that when the bad stuff started, Jules would be there. It was dark. Some of the zoo's night lights were off, probably knocked out by the storm. Eddie ran on instinct. He didn't know exactly where he was, and he had no plan. He just knew that he had to keep running. If only he could see, but between the dark and the blinding rain, he couldn't make out much more than vague shapes. He was afraid he might run into something that would be fatal. He chanced another look over his shoulder. Stink was further back now, and it looked as if he was having as much trouble seeing as Eddie was. Stink was fast, but he wasn't in real good shape. Eddie could see that. As tough as Stink was, long-distance running required stamina that he didn't have. Maybe there was a chance for Eddie after all. Eddie was running on a paved walkway. Now it branched both left and right, and he went left, but as he made the sharp turn, his feet went out from under him, bringing him down hard. He tried to bounce back up, but pain exploded where his right kneecap had made contact with the pavement. Eddie forced himself to get up. The pain was terrible, and each limping stride seemed to make it worse. He knew he couldn't go much further. He stared into the rain. There had to be something out there that might give him a chance. There, over there to the left, a structure vaguely familiar. Desperately, Eddie made for it. It was the wrong thing to do. What he'd seen was Last Sam's cage, and not until he was through its open door did he remember that there was only one way in and out. He turned around quickly. This was no good. He had to get out. He had to run somewhere, anywhere. He took one painful step toward the cage's door and stopped. Stink Pegler was blocking the way. He was slumped forward, gasping, with his hands on his knees, but he was looking up at Eddie and still grinning. Eddie knew he was beaten, but he was too tired and too sore to care. He hoped only that whatever was going to happen would happen quickly. The terrible answer to that thought came as Jules stumbled into the cage behind Stink. For a long minute, no one spoke. Aside from the rain, the only sound was their breathing, each hungrily gulping at the damp air. Eddie stood on one leg. He could put almost no weight on the injured one, and looked around. There would be no escape. The thunder and lightning had moved off, further away now. And suddenly the rain began to let up, too late to do him any good. Eddie's mind was working fast, but his thoughts were disjointed. Think. He couldn't seem to make his brain work right. Weird. All those times I thought Steve would kill me, and I end up getting a knife to the guts when he isn't even in the picture anymore. As Stink moved toward him, Eddie backed up. A couple of Shuffle steps, and his back was against the bars of the cage. Stink came closer now and held the knife out at Eddie's eye level. Stink Pigler was going to take his time. He was going to enjoy getting his revenge. Eddie tried to think of something, anything to say. He thought about begging, wondering if that might save him, but he knew it wouldn't, that it would only add to Stink's enjoyment. No, he wouldn't beg. You should think about getting some dental work. You are one ugly bastard. He didn't get to finish the sentence. Stink kicked him in the stomach, and Eddie folded up on the ground. New waves of pain rolling over and over him. The kick had propelled the air out of him like he was a popped balloon, and he could hear himself making sucking sounds as he tried to get new air. You were pretty good at kicking last time. Stink's voice seemed to be far away. It don't look like you enjoy it quite as much when you're the one getting kicked. Eddie didn't see the second kick coming. It caught him in the ribs. He heard a crack and knew that something inside him had broken. He braced himself for the next blow, but his face was against the floor of the cage, and he couldn't see Stink. He tried to get up, but the pain was too great. He felt himself sinking into a thick black fog. As he slipped in and out of consciousness, he was dimly aware that the nasal whine of Jules' voice, "Hey man, don't forget what you promised. You're gonna kill the little bastard before I get to teach him how to be real friendly." Eddie felt Stink take hold of his hair. He was being pulled to his feet. He groaned. The pain was awful, and he could taste blood in his mouth. He was on his knees with Stink standing over him. Eddie tried to get his good leg up underneath him. He could feel Jules groping at his belt. "Let's get those pants off, little man." Jules' voice was sing-song and disgusting. Eddie wanted to block it out, but he couldn't. Stink jerked him to his feet, and Eddie groaned again. The black fog seemed to be inviting him in again. Eddie felt himself slipping. Suddenly the world exploded around him. This wasn't unconsciousness. He knew that. It was something else. He tried to figure it out, make sense of it, but he couldn't. There was a shape moving fast. What was it? Then a noise. A loud noise, like a roar. Was it Last Sam? Did he want his cage back? Eddie had fallen back down and was on the side now. Nobody was pulling his hair or kicking him. He tried to push his way through the fog to open his eyes. He wanted to see what had made the roar. He forced his eyes open, but what he saw didn't make any sense. Jack Sim? Here? Now? That didn't figure at all. Eddie could see Jules lying on his back with a lot of blood on his face. He wasn't moving, and there was Jack kneeling over Stink. Jack had a knife. It wasn't the switchblade. This was a big knife, the knife Eddie had seen in Jack's house. He forced himself up on one elbow. He had to know if this was real, that it wasn't part of the fog dream. Jack was holding the knife up to Stink Pigler's face. Jack's other hand had one of Stink's arms twisted around behind his back. "You're a dead man, you goddamn psycho!" Stink screamed, then spat in Jack's face. Now that the storm had ended, there was a heavy silence all around. The only sounds that broke the stillness were the ones Jack and Stink were making. Jack made a small movement. There was a crack, and Stink screamed. Eddie knew that Jack had broken Stink's arm. Stink's scream died out and was replaced by a moan. Now here's the deal, boy." Jack hissed the words into Stink's face. "You can stick your deal up your ass. You can stink your deal up your ass, old man." Stink's face was twisted with pain and rage. "You're not listening," Jack said quietly. He flicked his wrist, a movement so small, so quick that Eddie barely saw it. But now there was blood streaming out of a cut next to Stink Pigler's nose. Are you ready to listen now? You son of a... Jack's hand moved again, and there was another cut, this one at the corner of Stink's eye. I should probably tell you I'm pretty good with this thing. I can flick your eye out in just as easy as I can cut alongside it. So maybe you should think about listening to what I have to say. Stink's eyes were wide open now. He seemed to grasp that whoever this man was, he was dangerous. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Good. Jack's voice was soft as death. Though he couldn't see Jack's face, Eddie knew that all the guilt and fury and hate that Jack had carried inside him since that day so many years before was coming out now. Eddie wondered if Stink Pegler realized how close he was to dying. This boy is my friend, he heard Jack's voice telling Stink. I don't want anything to happen to him. Not tonight, not ever. And if anything does happen to him, anything, and that includes your sick friend over there, I'm going to assume that you're the one responsible. I'll find you, and I'll finish renovating your face. And when I'm finished, your mother won't recognize you. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Yeah. Good. Understand this as well. Jack used the point of the knife to turn Stink's face so that Stink was looking at him. It's all I can do to keep from killing you tonight. I can't tell you how much I want to leave you right here on the floor of this cage. Either one, you give me a reason ever, and there isn't a thing in this world that will stop me from doing that. Nothing in this world. Nothing will happen to him, Stink Pegler's voice signaled his surrender. Eddie knew Stink meant it. He knew he would never have to fear Stink or his crowd ever again. It was all there in 5 words he'd just spoken, not the words themselves, but the way he'd said them. Without moving the tip of the knife from Stink's cheek, Jack looked over his shoulder at Eddie. In that instant, Eddie understood why Stink had made the promise in his whole life. Eddie had never seen anything like the look on Jack's face. It was the look of suffering and fear and hate and death. It was like looking at the end of the world. Eddie hoped he would never see anything like it ever again. Eddie moved. He wanted to get up, but as he moved, the pain surrounded him, and the black fog rolled around and over him. The fog was thicker now, and it felt warm, inviting. Eddie let himself drift into the soft, welcoming folds of the misty darkness.